Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, welcome to the opening of the resumed high-level segment on the occasion of the 26th session of the Conference of the Parties, the 16th session of the Conference of the Parties, serving as a meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and the third session of the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. Good afternoon, friends. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Last week, leaders from around the world stood on this stage and told us of the urgent need to act on climate. And now, together, in the remaining days of this summit, we need to put their words into action. Now, we have made some good progress over the past week, and parties have come to the table with a can-do attitude. And we have agreed substantive outcomes on a range of issues, from gender to agriculture. But we still have a lot to do. And frankly, on some vital issues, there is still too far between us. And so these next few days, we are absolutely going to need to see a change in gear. Like you, I have greatly enjoyed my time in Glasgow so far, but I'm sure that we all share a desire to finish on Friday, having agreed an ambitious outcome. And that means all of us putting in the work to find solutions fast and together. As I said yesterday, I have invited ministerial colleagues to undertake consultations on the key issues to get us to near final text by the end of tomorrow. And this work will complement the presidency and technical tracks. This approach has been based on extensive consultations with parties and groups. And I want to emphasize again that I am committed to transparency, to inclusivity, and the party-driven nature of the process over the next few days, as indeed we have been throughout our presidency. And indeed, the next days are going to require an enormous effort from all of us. But we must deliver, because the public will be incensed if the power of the words spoken last week by world leaders is not followed by swift, decisive, and conclusive action. And I know that we all share a will to succeed. I can feel that at this conference. Together, we can deliver. So I look forward to hearing from you today and to working with you all to forge a strong outcome over the coming days. Distinguished delegates, before we begin hearing national statements, I would like to remind parties whose head of state or government has already delivered a national statement during the first part of the high-level segment on 1st and 2nd of November to please refrain from making another national statement and have the statement posted on the UNFCCC website. As we begin the national statements, I would like to remind representatives of the actions in place to ensure effective time management, namely the 3-minute time limit for statements during the high-level segment. Please be reminded that statements should be as concise and brief as possible, as full text of the official statements will be made available on the UNFCCC website. Speaking slots for those who are not in the plenary in time for delivery of their statements will be scheduled to speak at the end of all statements of the same category. Now, let me also remind you of the COVID-19 protocols to ensure that the health and safety of all participants is maintained. In accordance with the UNFCCC COP26 COVID-19 Code of Conduct, and I quote, participants must wear face coverings except when eating, drinking, sitting in office spaces and meetings, or sitting to perform negotiations, or they are medically exempt. United Nations guidance and practice recommends face coverings to be surgical or FFP2. Delegates should wear face masks while seated where social distancing is not possible. As part of the hygiene measures to ensure a safe environment of all participants, statements will be delivered from alternate rostrums. So, dear colleagues, let's start with the statements. And it is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Ali Salah Jaqi, Vice President and Head of the Department of Environment of Iran. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, Executive Secretary of UNFCCC, Honorable Ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be present in this August meeting. First of all, I would like to inform that my President, His Excellency Dr. Muhammad Ibrahim Raisi, was very much willing to attend this summit for not only his personal attachment to climate change and environmental issues, but also for the legal obligations according on domestic laws and regulation of my government to protect the collective right to clean and protect the environment of Iranian nation. However, on his behalf, I would like to extend his best wishes for the success of this conference. Mr. President, the government of Islamic Republic of Iran is committed alongside with other nations to combat climate change and global warming with the full support of the Supreme Leader to government and Iranian Environmental Department, whose head is of the rank of Vice President, devised a very ambitious national plan to cope with the consequences of climate change. However, Mr. President, when it comes the international cooperation and all stakeholders globally, unfortunately, my country faces an obstacle while is economic terrorism. Mr. President, we are facing a relevant question raised by members of Parliament when they are in the legal processes of ratification of Paris Agreement. That question is, if the Islamic Republic of Iran becomes the full member of Paris Agreement, while unilateral coercive sanction or measure are imposed on the whole country of Iran, how the government would be able to implement its commitments if it is unable to receive any international assistance, being financial or technical assistance from international community? That question still remains unanswered. And I put the same question before you, Mr. President, and all member states around this table. Why blind coercive measures are imposed on my country and few others, which not only are inflicting suffering on a nation, but also in undermining the global efforts to combat climate change to the benefit of the humanity? This is the sad, long story of taking human issues as a hostage for political objective of a few, if not one. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Aissatou Touré, Vice President of, Her Excellency, Ms. Aissatou Touré, Vice President of the Gambia. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, on behalf of His Excellency, Mr. Adama Barrow, President of the Republic of the Gambia, I wish to extend my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the Prime Minister and government and people of the United Kingdom for hosting COP26 amidst COVID-19. We must build on the enthusiasm shown by world leaders in 2015. The realities of climate change have gone beyond doubt and debate. The most vulnerable countries are bearing the brunt of its impacts. In the Gambia, 2 recent windstorms occurred in July and September 2021, causing terrible destructions to properties and claimed many innocent lives. In addition to the storms, disruptions in rainfall at the beginning of this year's rainy season resulted in delayed planting of vital crops in many areas in the country. In 2014, we asked the following questions. If urgent action is not taken now, when shall we take them? When shall we act to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions? These questions, in my view, still remain unanswered. Nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and other commitments to the Paris Agreement are not sufficient enough to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Certainly, not enough to protect the lives of vulnerable communities in many developing countries around the world. As developing nations, I believe that we are doing more than our fair share in combating global warming. The Gambia, even though a small developing country in sub-Saharan Africa, do recognize the severity of climate change and never became hesitant to ratify the Paris Agreement and submitted her first and second NDCs. The Gambia's updated NDC is recognized by Climate Action Tracker as a fundamental commitment to reducing global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade above business as usual by 2050. On behalf of government, I would like to thank UNDP, IRENA, and ICLEI for contributing financially and technically to updating process of the NDC. In our national drive towards strengthening resilience and adaptation measures to climate change, the government of the Gambia is progressively implementing its climate change policy aimed at mainstreaming and building resilience of communities to climate change. Together, working with the United Nations Capital Development Fund, UNCDF, Local Adaptation Facility, to strengthen rural communities' resilience to climate change through jobs, skills, and finance. My country firmly believes that other governments, particularly the world's rich and developed countries, should do more and honor their past pledges to meet the unquestionable and the dire need of the world's poorest and most climate vulnerable people, especially those with the least resilience, who are put at the greatest risk from an ever-changing and unpredictable climate. I and my delegation expect nothing less from COP26 than tangible commitments that strengthen emission reduction targets to be consistent with 1.5 degrees and reflect each country's fair share of the global efforts. Without additional finances, investment in new technologies and strong capacities, our countries will find it extremely difficult to implement our ambitious climate action. We must not leave Glasgow without a robust and effective rule set for Paris Agreement, and this includes a post-2025 climate finance goal, ensure support to address loss and damage, as well as recognize the special needs and circumstances of the LDCs. Let's remember that our lives and livelihoods depends on the decisions we take. It is time to act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Alexei Overchuk, Deputy Chairman of the Government of the Russian Federation. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, addressing global warming and prevention of climate change depends on the ability of all nations to set aside differences and join together in resolving these challenges. Russia is mostly a northern country, yet we're facing negative impacts of global warming, including increase of desert areas, soil erosion, forest fires, floods, and melting of permafrost. We take these matters seriously and responsibly. As you might be well aware, the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, has announced that Russia will reach carbon neutrality by 2060. This promise is based on a comprehensive approach covering not only the problems of controlling and decreasing emission, but also managing and improving greenhouse gas absorption capabilities of our natural ecosystems, including forests, tundra, farmland, marshes, and seas. Taking a promise of reaching carbon neutrality by 2060 doesn't mean that Russia is refraining from achieving this goal earlier. The success depends on availability of new technologies and funds to finance these transitions. So through history, human ingenuity has always led to finding solutions for most complex issues. We're confident that this time humanity will also develop solutions that will bring a better future. Climate change requires all countries to work together and share knowledge and tools. Therefore, there should be no discrimination or restrictions preventing countries from accessing accessing and using technologies and financing tools that will facilitate development of new sustainable infrastructure, capture and storage, decarbonization, improvement of energy efficiency, and support transition to cleaner energy. And if someone will be hampering this, all of us would know who should be blamed for failing to reach climate goals. International efforts are also critical for enhancing cooperation in areas of ecosystem management, developing and improving monitoring and reporting emission and absorption practices, as well as measuring progress in meeting climate goals. It is critical to develop common, fair, and transparent rules for carbon pricing measurement and ensure their multilateral recognition and comparability between countries. In October 2021, the Russian government has adopted a new 2050 strategy of social and economic development with low greenhouse gas emission. This strategy outlines measures that by 2050, compared to 1990, will bring our country to an 80% net reduction of greenhouse gas emissions while maximizing absorbing capacity of our forests and other ecosystems. It also outlines low greenhouse gas emission development measures till 2050. To achieve those ambitious objectives, we're focusing on improving our forest management practices, enhancing wildfire prevention response capabilities, increase wilderness areas, introducing new farming practices, as well as engaging in transformation towards cleaner energy. Our energy companies are implementing low-emission technologies to ensure production, delivery, and distribution of clean fuel to consumers. Our regions are engaging in pilot projects that will help finding solutions to those problems. We welcome participation of international community in these projects. Renewable energy sources are increasing their share in energy balances through the world, with 86% of our energy generation coming from solar, wind, natural gas, nuclear, and hydropower. Russia is already an example of low carbon emissions per unit. We intend to maintain this leadership by introducing blue and green hydrogen and promoting the use of new fuel through economy. At the same time, our government strategy is pursuing the goal of finding and maintaining balance between policies aimed at addressing climate changes and reaching sustainable development goals to continue economic growth and improvement of living standards of our people. Building a safer environment implies significant investment and changes that will affect economies, create new markets, redirect resources, and alter supply chains as well as lives of the people. It is our deep belief that addressing global warming and climate change should not lead to further increase of poverty, not just in the developing world, but in the developed world as well. The transition to new economy should be based on an equilibrium where investment returns and long-term asset value increase will be balanced by reliable energy supply that meets growing energy demand as well as the goals of reduction and absorption of greenhouse gas emissions. The solution of this equilibrium will determine the living standard of our descendants, and this is the new economic balance that all of us will need to find together. And while this will be happening, and at the time of this enormous change and in the future, Russia will remain a reliable supply of energy to international markets and consumers. I hope I didn't take a lot of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Aziz Abduhakimov, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Tourism and Sports of Uzbekistan. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Dear Chairman, dear heads of delegations, on behalf of the Republic of Uzbekistan, I sincerely welcome all participants of the summit and express thanks to the organizers for inviting to this important event. Obviously, climate change is one of the main challenges of our time that directly affects the quality of our life. Today, its consequences are unprecedented in scale. They are manifested in our region too. Due to the drying up of the Oral Sea, climatic changes in Central Asia occur with twice the intensity of the world average. Among the negative consequences are the increase of the frequency and geography of the dust storms, worsening of the problem of land degradation and decline of water resources. We are in New Uzbekistan paying the most serious attention to issues of the green agenda. As His Excellency Shavkat Mirziyoyev, the President of Uzbekistan, stated at the 76th session of UN General Assembly, it is our human duty toward present and future generations. At the national level, we are actively implementing a comprehensive strategy for the transition to the green economy. The energy efficiency of our economy will double by 2030. The share of renewable energy will be no less than 25%. Within the framework of the Paris Agreement, we undertake the additional obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emission per unit of GDP by 35% by 2030 compared with the indicators for 2010. To achieve this goal, we plan to develop a national low-carbon development strategy. Also, annually, 200 million trees, including 2021, will be planted in Uzbekistan. At the regional level, we are taking decisive action to combat drought and water shortages, mitigate the consequences of the RLC disaster, and ensure socio-economic development of the adjacent territories. Next year, we intend to hold a high-level international forum on green energy under the auspices of UN. I would like to invite all delegates of the summit to take part in upcoming forum. This event will become an important step in the implementation of the UN General Assembly Special Resolution, which was adopted in May this year, to declaring the RLC region as a zone of environmental innovation and technologies. We count on the support of the project within the activities of the Multi-Partner Human Security Trust Fund for the RLC region. At the global level, we welcome the recent G20 agreement to adopt a balanced and effective global biodiversity framework. Uzbekistan supports the joint declaration on forest and land use adopted during the summit. We are ready to host the 6th high-level UN Environment Assembly in 2023. We will continue to support international efforts to ensure green future of our planet. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Dennis Ronaldo Moncada Colindres, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nicaragua. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President of COP26, distinguished ministers, heads of delegations, vice ministers also, and heads of and delegates, we would like to convey to you the kindred greetings of the President of the Republic of Nicaragua, Comandante Daniel Ortega Saavedra, and his colleague, Vice President Rosario Murillo. This greeting to all of you peoples and governments represented here. Nicaragua is not responsible for the climate crisis. Central America is not responsible for the climate crisis. The climate crisis is the historic responsibility of the major economies who have been implementing consumption production models which pollute Mother Earth. Nicaragua firmly believes in multilateralism as the means to tackle climate change, as well as the crisis of values. I say this because climate change is already history. What we experience today is not just climate change, it's a climate crisis threatening the existence of humanity. If we continue without providing solutions and without providing an effective response to the climate crisis, humanity could be heading relentlessly towards its own extinction. The problem is straightforward. 10 industrialized countries emit 83% of global emissions, whilst the lowest 100 emitters only emit 3%. Our Mother Earth is agonizing. CO2 concentrations are at their highest levels of the last 2,000 years, namely 420 ppm, parts per million, whereas the maximum level acceptable is 320 ppm. We are emitting into the atmosphere over 59 billion tons of CO2, whereas the maximum acceptable level would be 14 billion. We have already seen increases in global average temperature of 1.1 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial levels. Mr. President, this global crisis, which has local impacts, calls for a response from the highest political level, especially from those who are causing climate change. Nicaragua has presented 4 declarations before this COP, containing proposals which are crucial for us to combine our global efforts to revert the disastrous effects of climate change. Number 1, the Declaration of Central America and the Caribbean as a highly vulnerable region, vulnerable to extreme climate events. Number 2, the declaration to put mitigation and adaptation, or rather loss and damage, on an equal footing with mitigation and adaptation. The declaration on the urgency to preserve and recover the forests, which is why we've joined the COP26 Global Declaration on Forest Conservation. And finally, the declaration on climate justice with reparation as a basis to implement the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Mr. Chairman, unlawful unilateral coercive measures must come to an end right now to guarantee stability, peace, and to enable us to meet our climate targets. This through respecting the legitimate rights to development of the world's families, peoples, and nations. On the 7th of November, the people of Nicaragua proved once again that it was committed to peace and democracy because we held harmonious, free, fair, and sovereign elections through which Nicaragua decided to continue to be a homeland which is free, sovereign, and independent, putting the human being at the heart of its policies, and as well as the eradication of poverty and the protection and defense of our Mother Earth. Taiwan is firmly committed to combat climate change, and Taiwan is responding actively to the global drive to reach zero net emissions by 2050. That is why we express our support for Taiwan to be included in the climate negotiation mechanisms under the UNFCCC and under the Paris Agreement. To conclude, Mr. President, Nicaragua is convinced that the best way to tackle climate change is through tackling poverty, through human development, through improving our production capability from a sustainable approach, and in a climate of cooperation and respectful collaboration between states and societies. The presence of all the international community without exclusions at this COP26 is vital for us to be able to create a world based on understanding, peace, justice, solidarity, and sustainable development, and this in harmony with nature. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Adalgisa Magno, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Timor-Leste. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, President of the COP26, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Our Mother Earth is getting warmer now. The recent report of IPCC Working Group 1 indicated that emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities are responsible for approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming since 1850. Both extreme events and slow onset events become more intense due to this rate of temperature increase. Consequently, the impact of climate change, such as floods, droughts, landslides, sea level rise, cyclones, and other related climate-induced disasters have been severely affecting our socio-economy and environment across the world. The most affected ones will be those who have limited financial, technological, and human capacity to adapt to the impact of climate change, especially the LDCs and SIDS. Timor-Leste has been experiencing massive floods, droughts, landslides, fire hazard, and extreme weather events. These climate change impacts lead to decreases in agriculture production, food insecurity, water shortage, destruction of infrastructure, loss of human life, as well as human displacement. This year, Timor-Leste was hit by the tropical cyclone Seroja on 4th of April with massive floods and landslides across the country, causing loss of human lives and losses and damages to property. At least 42 people were killed and thousands of people lost their property and displaced. Climate change is really affecting our life now. All need to act now and ready to deliver. We urge the developed countries parties to take the lead in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and other major emitting countries to do so in order to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We also request the developed country parties to provide finance, technology, and capacity building support for developing countries in order to enable adaptation and mitigation actions, including enabling mitigation actions to limit temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius. As one of the small countries with very low rate of greenhouse gas emission, Timor-Leste is fully engaged to have low carbon development path with priorities given to renewable energy and reforestation. At the moment, we are in the process of adapting our national determined contributions, which has captured our climate change-related policies and plans on adaptation and mitigation. We have also submitted our national adaptation plans to the UNFCCC Secretariat with various adaptation priorities and looking forward for financial support in order to ensure a full and effective implementation of our adaptation priorities. At this COP26, we must take robust and tangible decisions on commitments and means of implementation for adaptation and mitigation. Long-standing climate finance commitments by the developed country parties, 100 billion per year by 2020, must now be fulfilled and mobilized. This climate finance must be new and additional to the current order. In addition, the developed country parties need to provide more financial contribution as new additional current pledge of 100 billion in the post-2025 regime, including finance for addressing loss and damage and equal financial allocation for adaptation and mitigation. In the same way, it is also time for us to deliver technology transfer and capacity building for enabling the LDCs and seeds for supporting adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. Mr. President, the operationalization of Santiago Network for loss and damage is one of our utmost priority for this COP26. This operationalization of the network must be guided by the COP and CMA regarding the VMO government. Timor-Leste is the view of the WIM shall be governed by the COP and CMA. It is our view that WIM was established under COP decision and further anchored under the Paris Agreement. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm now going to request COP Rapporteur Ahmed Rajabi to assume the chair.
It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Mobila Mobula, Minister of External Relations of Cameroon. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. On the occasion of the COP21 in Paris, the President of the Republic of Cameroon, His Excellency Paul Biya, reaffirmed his country's constant determination to work with other partners for the protection of the environment and the fight against the effects of climate change. He then made the following statement, I quote, "We are here to meet the expectations and hopes of our peoples. So let us show determination and political courage. Yes, let us be bold and wise," end of quote. The united front that President Paul Biya strongly advocates is the focus of this historic COP, and this was highlighted during the high-level segment of Head of State and Government held on 1st and 2nd November 2021. Meanwhile, subsequent negotiations revealed that divergent positions persist. Despite these differences, the delegation of Cameroon welcomes the consensus that has emerged in order to accelerate innovative scientific and shared research adapted to the objectives of zero carbon by 2050. In order to mitigate global warming and reach the limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius while gaining growth points without compromising the quality of life of our citizens, the following are the proposals of my country. Premièrement,
first of all, concerning respect for commitments that are commensurate to the challenges, we note first of all that throughout the COPs, the string of promises followed by very few effects has created frustrations that could discredit the major actors in the process. Cameroon, consequently, considers that it is urgent that this trend be reversed in order to further support the fight against climate change. Developed countries and technical and financial partners must keep the commitments they have made whilst also planning to revise them up with a view to the forecasts contained in the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Secondly, the $100 billion that was promised and which was set as a goal in Paris in 2015 to support countries in this struggle must be mobilized. If it is not, this could erode the already weakened credibility of the process and undermine the achievement of results. Secondly, on the subject of procedures for accessing financing, the difficulties include the heavy dependence of countries of the South on external financing and the length, the complexity, and the regular changes in the procedures for accessing these financial resources. And so Cameroon would also like to propose the following. Firstly, procedures, regardless of the fund or financing in question, must be streamlined and simplified on a more equitable basis and a less competitive basis without in any way becoming less objective. Secondly, intermediaries and middlemen between the funds and finances themselves and the countries must be eliminated and replaced by accredited national entities that have been trained beforehand to this end. Thirdly, financing devoted to carbon capture and storage in countries which, like Cameroon, store a great deal more carbon than they emit in the form of greenhouse gases should be substantial. What's more, it should, on the one hand, allow for the establishment of equitable and sustainable alternatives which benefit communities that depend on forest resources, and on the other hand, ensure that conservation activities are carried out. The fight to keep the global average temperature within 1.5 degrees will be won with the efforts of the countries of the Congo Basin brought together within COMEFAC, or it will be lost. Fourthly, specific funds need to be channeled towards initiatives aiming to restore degraded lands in order to create new carbon sinks, sources of carbon storage, whilst also contributing to increasing the resilience of societies. Mr. President, turning now to correcting the imbalance between mitigation and adaptation, Cameroon proposes, one, that we consider it imperative and urgent to correct the imbalance that we have seen in the allocation of resources to mitigation and adaptation. That is to say, 50% for each of these aspects, instead of 75% for mitigation and 25% for adaptation, as is the case at the moment. 2, our country supports the operationalization of the global adaptation goal, including through the development of specific relevant indicators devoted not only to adaptation, but also to monitoring resilience and the vulnerability of societies and economies. In sum, under the very high impetus of His Excellency Paul Biya, President of the Republic of Cameroon, during the revision of Cameroon's nationally determined contribution, its NDC, Cameroon confirmed its commitment to this international momentum by taking its greenhouse gas reduction commitment from 32% to 35%, or 12% unconditionally and 23% conditional upon support from the international community. And faithful to this commitment, our country, thanks to your support and with all of your support, sees the fight against climate change as a development opportunity rather than as an insurmountable challenge. Every country has a part of the code that will allow us to access this new age in which the planet will breathe new air, clean air, without carbon but rich in oxygen. Young generations are calling upon us to take action rather than simply the same old aspirations. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Franz Timmermans, Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal, and His Excellency Mr. Andrja Vizac, Minister of Environment and Special Planning of Slovenia, speaking jointly on behalf of the European Union Group. Excellencies, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Jointly, but not at the same time. Dear friends, the first week of our conference has been characterized by promising declarations and great promises by our leaders, and also by great work of the presidency and Patricia and her team. And I do appreciate everything that's been done by delegations and negotiators so far. But the honest truth is that we are not where we need to be, not even close. We're moving in the right direction, yes, but the world is still too far away from our 1.5-degree goal. This week, before we leave this conference, we need to make sure that we take decisions that put us on track to reaching our goal. And this needs to be done within a year, because time is running out. This is about addressing the effects of the crisis that we are already in. It's not just about preventing things getting even worse, but we need to really realize that today is a day we need to act on adaptation as well. Financing adaptation is critical. We all repeated that mantra endlessly, but the rhetoric, sadly, is not followed by action. We all need to get cracking, and we all need to do it now. That is why the European Commission will contribute 100 million euros to the Adaptation Fund, because those who need resources for adaptation also need to have predictability and clarity about its delivery. To the parties pushing for more ambition, I say this: you will find the EU on your side. To the parties stopping and stalling progress, I say, what are you waiting for? Science tells us we're out of time. Extreme weather events show us the consequences everywhere on our planet. To everyone here I say, let's overcome our differences and find solutions this week. COP26 is not a place for disagreement and narrow-mindedness. COP26 must be where we work together and succeed together. It's time. Thank you.
Dear President, distinguished ministers, colleagues, firstly, I would like to thank UK Presidency for all their efforts so far. IPCC report clearly shows that global warming can only be limited to 1.5 degrees. Strong reductions in greenhouse gas are undertaken. Collectively, we need to urgently step up global climate mitigation ambition in the near term as well ahead of 2030. We have heard strong and clear voice by civil society, especially by youth, that more ambitious climate action is needed. And now in Glasgow we have the opportunity to demonstrate that we have responded to their message. The EU is fully committed to work in this direction. We need to come to a clear, comprehensive and balanced outcome which will ensure an ambitious global response to climate change, keeping the 1.5 degree goal within reach, in line with the best available science. Many things are very important. First, we would like to conclude on robust Article 6 rules which must avoid double counting and ensure environmental integrity. Concluding on arrangements under the enhanced transparency framework, and this is a key element of Paris Agreement. Reaching a consensus on common time frame for all parties to be fully aligned with the Paris Agreement and ambitious cycle. Continuing discussion on setting the new post-2025 collective goal on climate finance, recognizing the needs of developing countries. Continuing the discussion on the global goal on adaptation and achieving work on loss and damage. EU firmly believes that only international engagement through strong rule-based multilateralism and human rights-based approach will enable us to achieve successful results in addressing climate change. Dear colleagues, ministers, our responsibility for achieving goals of the Paris Agreement is a shared commitment. We need to increase mitigation efforts, scale up adaptation measures, and increase the mobilization of climate finance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Ahmado Sebori Tor, Executive Director of the Fund for Environment Safeguard, Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Guinea, speaking on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The
Republic of Guinea this year has the honor and the privilege of being president of G77 and China. This group is made up of 134 developing countries within the UN system, that is, and it is made up of 6 billion human beings on this planet. I would like to avail myself of this opportunity to thank, on behalf of His Excellency, the Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, the President of the Transitional President, Head of State, Head of the Armed Forces of Guinea, for having given Guinea this mark of confidence. Mr. President, we'd like to assure you of the commitment of our group, commitment to support you, and together with our partners, brothers and sisters in Glasgow to ensure that Glasgow COP26 is a success which can enable us to implement the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. As a developing country, our quest for development and poverty eradication must be respected and safeguarded. The growing impacts of climate change, the loss and damage associated with our economic and social circumstances throw up increasingly difficult challenges. Our development prospects are dwindling, as well as the social impact and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the loss of our biodiversity and of the unbearable debt in terms of economic recession and unfair trade. Our right to sustainable development is better protected by the implementation of the implementation of the guiding principle enshrined in the UNFCCC in the Paris Agreement, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and differentiated capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. This principle is based on the concept of equity and international justice. The Paris Agreement, adopted pursuant to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the collective realization of all the parties and is designed to strengthen the implementation of the UNFCCC. This is the context. The COP26 context, the context in which we, the developing countries, are responding, depending on different national circumstances, responding to greater ambition for mitigation and adaptation. We call upon our developed partners to be more ambitious by taking the initiative to reduce their emissions and by being more ambitious in providing support to developing countries, and in particular as far as adaptation is concerned, as well as the response measures impacts on loss and damage also stemming from climate change. We call upon the developed countries to keep their word. We can no longer accept hollow speeches on financing of climate or climate financing. The old promises on the raising of the $100 billion per year must be respected. You must keep your promises. Adaptation support must be provided. The financing of loss and damage is necessary. Equity and justice are the cornerstones that will ensure that the implementation of the Paris Agreement will be of benefit to developing countries and will support their sustainable development. The group would like to underscore the importance to ensure that the outcome of COP26 reflects the fragile balance of the Paris Agreement, including on matters pertaining to adaptation and mitigation and implementation means this outcome should not be renegotiated nor reinterpreted within the Paris Agreement and should attest to the commitment of all parties to fully implement the agreement in the context of their respective capabilities and responsibilities. Developed countries are should lead this pursuant to what is enshrined in the UNFCCC. It would be remiss of me if it did not, in my conclusion, say the following. We're not showing the right example. We're not leading by example. And I say this because when you go to the toilet or the common areas or the offices, when you speak of effectiveness and energy efficiency, I can assure you in the toilets, in these offices, the light is on all the time. That has always been the case. And I know we can do better. Our responsibility is individual before it is collective. Individually, let us face our responsibilities so that collectively we can reach our targets for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Vera Mori, Minister for Environment, Conservation and Climate Change of Papua New Guinea, speaking on behalf of the Coalition of Rainforest Nations. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. His Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Papua New Guinea's country statement was delivered by the Prime Minister, which got incorporated last week during the Leaders' Summit. By way of introduction, I'd like to basically here, speaking on behalf of the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, which is a composition membership of 52 countries, hosting the most valuable asset that reduces carbon dioxide. Before I basically make that, I'd like to make these remarking statements, making reference to what Dr. Zimmerman has said, who made reference in a way to Dr. Sir David Attenborough last week when he said that on the geological time scale, we are 1 minute to midnight. This is a statement that we all need to take note of. Having said that, at the outset, we align ourselves as Coalition of Rainforest Nations with a statement made by Guinea on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. Mr. President, at the outset, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change study indicated the effects of climate change are much more severe than anybody have ever imagined. Achieving the 1.5-degree threshold as defined by the IPCC is therefore a must, and COP26 must deliver. Mr. President, let's be clear. The 1.5-degree goal is unattainable without REDD+ and full considerations of the world's rainforest nations. Dramatically slowing global deforestation is needed, and the REDD+ mechanism is singularly designed to achieve that goal. Article 5 of the Paris Agreement defines REDD+ as the only mechanisms to implement forestry activities, whether it is deforestation, degradation, or conservation. REDD+ is our North Star or our focal point. It is based on a set of decisions that have been agreed and are now being implemented. Developing countries are now hard at work on Article 5, which should not be reopened. Our work to date should not be disrupted by the same token. Mr. President, environmental integrity must be at the core of our work, and the Glasgow outcome must be built on this principle. REDD+ decisions already ensure a high level of environmental integrity, and all other sectors should be based on the same rules, notably greenhouse gas inventories and national reference levels. The same stringency should be reflected in Article 6 guidance, as this is a critical condition for the private sector to engage with the Paris Agreement. The last element of the enhanced transparency framework created by the Paris Agreement must include clear and simple decisions that are consistent with previously agreed rules. Emission reductions or removals not included in our national determined contributions, national monitoring system, and greenhouse gas inventories must not qualify for international transfer. Mr. President, rainforest nations have already delivered more than 9 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This is an outstanding figure and proof that the REDD+ mechanism has been of immediate benefit. These actions deserve to be adequately rewarded so that we can continue to effectively address the global climate emergency. For this reason, we call for clarity that REDD+ results are included in the definition of ITMOS. As agreed back in Katowice, agreed REDD+ MRV is concurrent to the new transparency process. To avoid redundancy, the rules on Article 6.2 must be consistent with this approach. Mr. President, adaptation is of utmost importance for our countries. We must agree on a clear plan to define the global goal on adaptation. Adaptation finance should not be a small percentage of mitigation. It should be real, predictable, and at scale. Finance for adaptation projects should come exclusively from developed countries, as Article 6.2 is a critical tool allowing countries to fulfill their NDCs. It should include incentive for early pre-2020 RED Plus actions and should only include activities inside their respective NDCs. This is the only way to reach the 1.5 degree centigrade goal. RED Plus is part of the Paris Agreement. The CDM is part of the past. Mr. President, we have all made sacrifices to attend COP26. Traveling during a global pandemic, it is therefore imperative that we respect all views and engage all parties to make Glasgow a success. As usual, you can count on us and our support to deliver what this world is expecting. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Murat Kurum, Minister of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change of Turkey. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much. Esteemed ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I salute you with respect. At the 26th Conference of the Parties, we are passing through a period in which the decisions taken and concrete steps to be taken within the scope of combating climate change have become extremely critical for our common home, the world. If we do not take steps to protect our natural resources, our world will be dragged into greater uncertainty. The most tangible indication of this is the disasters that are experienced all over the world and that we encounter a different type of it every day. Esteemed ministers, distinguished participants, in our country, located in the Mediterranean basin, we are exposed to disasters such as floods, landslides, and forest fires, the frequency and severity of which increase every year, and we lose lives. As Turkey, we have been effectively fighting against these disasters caused by the climate crisis for 20 years. Finally, our country has become a party to the Paris Agreement as a result of the unanimous decision of the Turkish Grand National Assembly. Immediately afterwards, our President, Mr. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, announced to the world our vision of green development within the 2053 net zero emission target. As a result of this vision put forward by our president, we changed our ministry to the ministry's name to the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change. We have entered a new period in which we will develop more effective strategies and policies in our fight against the climate crises with the climate change presidency, which we established under the responsibility of our ministry. We act in cooperation with our relevant institutions, universities, and NGOs. Together with our institutions, we have started to prepare long-term strategies and action plans in line with our country's 2053 commitment to net zero emissions target. We are preparing the climate law, which contains the policies, targets, and regulations for climate change. We are updating Turkey's climate change strategy and nationally determined contribution with the target of 2053. We have activated the action plan necessary for harmonization with the European Green Deal. We are establishing the emission trading system infrastructure, which will support investments in climate-friendly and clean production technologies. We are making our provinces resistant to climate change with our regional and local climate change action plans. We are rolling out the Zero Waste project, which we carry out under the leadership of the Honorable Wife of the President, First Lady, throughout our country. We have increased our sink by increasing our forest assessed from 20.8 million hectares to approximately 23 million hectares. In the last 5 years, we have become the first country in Europe and the 6th country in the world with our reforestation activities. By increasing the share of renewable energy sources in our installed capacity to 53%, we have reached 12th place in the world and 5th place in Europe in this area. In order for our cities to breathe, we built a national garden in each of our cities, and we give life to biological diversity with ecological corridors. We are increasing our conserved natural areas. Thus, we protect our natural resources from the danger of pollution and extinction. As Turkey, we will continue to carry out efforts to combat the climate crisis with determination for the future of our world and our children. Esteemed ministers, distinguished participants, it is imperative that countries that have historical responsibility in the emergence of problems that cause climate change should take responsibility with the same sincerity. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a development, it's a security issue that deeply affects all countries. Our duty is to take our measures in the face of this threat with a fair burden sharing based on fairness and to fulfill our obligations quickly. As the great thinker Rumi said, we do not need someone to give advice, we need someone to set an example. We have always acted with this consciousness. We have not been indifferent to any global problems, crises, and calls. We will continue to do our part in the fight against climate change and in the protection of the environment, and we will continue to do so in the future. Based on the idea that a fairer world is possible, as stated by our president, our country will continue to stand by the countries most affected by climate change. And I conclude my remarks by saying I greet you once again with respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Heian Grasfu, Minister for Sustainability and the Environment of Singapore. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, even as we grapple with COVID-19, we need to take urgent collective action to address global climate crisis. This conference needs to demonstrate that the multilateral framework of cooperation delivers on climate action. First, all parties must come forward with ambitious, nationally determined contributions and long-term low-emissions development strategy and deliver concrete implementation plans to achieve them. COP26 must provide a clear roadmap on how to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. Second, we must complete negotiations under the Paris Agreement Work Programme, particularly on Article 6, to operationalize global carbon markets. Third, COP26 must deliver a strong climate finance package for developing countries. Fourth, we must encourage effective partnerships and alliances to harness low-carbon technologies through the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action. Singapore is committed to playing our part in the global fight against climate change. We submitted our enhanced NDC and LDDS in March last year and launched the Singapore Green Plan 2030, which sets out concrete, near-term plans to achieve our net zero aspiration. We are a densely populated small city-state with no hinterland and limited access to renewable energy. But we do not shy away from taking bold actions. We aim to quadruple our solar deployment by 2025. We are capping private vehicle growth to 0, and we aim to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles by 2040. We will plant 1 million trees, 1 million more trees by 2030. We will revise our carbon tax and announce the new tax early next year. We will green 80% of our built environment. We aim to import 30% of energy mix from renewable sources by 2035. As international collaborations and new enabling technologies materialize, we will review and enhance our climate goals. Last week, we joined several partnership coalitions, including the Powering Past Co-Alliance, the Global Coal to Clean Power Transition Statement, the Global Methane Pledge, the Greening Government Initiative, and the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate. We're also collaborating with Australia, Chile, New Zealand, and the US on low-carbon technologies and have commenced negotiations on a bilateral green economy agreement with Australia, a world's first agreement that combines trade, economic, and environment objectives. To support Asia's decarbonization drive, we've introduced initiatives to enhance financial sector resilience to environmental risks, develop green finance solutions and capabilities, and grow our ecosystem for services in carbon markets and carbon management. Mr. President, international climate change cooperation is key to achieving an outcome that's far greater than the sum of our parts. Singapore will work with the UK and all parties to secure strong outcomes for COP26. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. James Cadet, Minister of Environment of Haiti. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président de la... Mr. President of the COP, Madam Executive Secretary of the Convention, distinguished members of delegations here present, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to speak to you at this 26th COP of the UNFCCC. On behalf of the Haitian people and His Excellency the Prime Minister, Dr. Ariel Henry, I would like to voice my deep gratitude to the government of the United Kingdom and to the Italian policymakers for the efforts made to make it possible for this 26th COP to take place in this difficult context of the new coronavirus pandemic. I would also like to pay tribute to the Secretary General of the United Nations and to the Executive Secretary of the Convention for their outstanding contribution to the fight against climate change worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, science has shown us once again that the phenomenon is growing and we must act, and science has triggered the alarm bell. And when I say it's urgent that we act, we really must act, Mr. President. And I say this because the sixth report of the IPCC, and this is a reliable report, the sixth report has highlighted not only the fact that we see that global warming is happening more and more, and things are changing, have changed over the last few decades, but also it has shown that where the windows of opportunities are narrow to put the planet back on track for a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. Climate change problems affect, first and foremost, countries such as Haiti, whose environmental and demographic vulnerability is undeniable. We do not need to recall this. The climate change is a crucial problem which is likely to upset global geopolitics and is likely subsequently to worsen social and economic troubles. In Haiti, such a situation would in all likelihood give rise to an exponential rise in adaptation costs as well as costs associated with loss and damage. Over the last 10 years, the loss caused by climate disasters in Haiti have increased significantly, with, in 2020, an expenditure of $400 million, which represents 50% of the international aid we get and 20% of the state's budget. The environmental problems we experience have harmed the well-being of our country in terms of our ability to control the environment, to manage our resources, natural resources, and in our ability to have relations with other countries. This affects the lifestyle of our country's population and security. That is why, to reduce the impacts of climate shocks which weaken our country, despite our limited capabilities, we have implemented concrete actions to contribute to the overall objective of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. As far as governance is concerned, Haiti this year is finalizing its second nationally determined contribution, as well as its national adaptation plan and its environmental plan of action. We have got our industries to talk to each other so that we can mainstream climate change in our national and subnational development strategies. Through the National Committee on Climate Change that we've just recently created. Mr. President, every year we have a string of disasters buffeting our country, some causing irreversible damage, as a result of which we constantly fall and have to get up again, as a result of which several thousands of our compatriots have to take it upon themselves to become internally displaced persons. You will understand, Mr. President, this has become a matter of life and death for the great majority of Haitians, and it is likely to further complicate the economic and social and political context which has been engulfing Haiti for many years now. In the name of solidarity and climate justice, and in order to prevent instability from further extending in developing countries such as Haiti, it is important that we absolutely bring about a climate multilateralism paradigm change. The time of good intentions is over. Countries affected by phenomena such as Haiti can no longer wait. Whilst the world is making some efforts to solve climate change, a strong, clear signal must be sent by developed countries whose historic responsibility in the phenomenon has been proven once for all. This strong signal should be crystallized through, in particular, one, the respect for the 2009 financial commitments, and more precisely the $100 million per year from 2020, without forgetting the identification of ways and means for the new 2025 financial ceiling. Secondly, greater financing for adaptation, in particular for most vulnerable countries, to put adaptation on a par with the mitigation. Number three, a streamlining of procedures to have access to climate financing. Number four, a carefully crafted program for the monitoring of the overall adaptation objective of the Paris Agreement. Next, the recognition of loss and damage as a pillar separated from adaptation. And finally, an additional financing mechanism to avoid, minimize, and address the exceptional questions of loss and damage. Mr. President, if some of the aspects I've just listed to are extremely important for our country, we need more support measures for us to be better equipped to combat climate change, which includes the measures on common timeframes for NDCs, transfer of technology, and the capacity building for the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. In this respect, Mr. President, my country is eager that this COP finalize its work on the rules for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate crisis linked to the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that our lives are closely linked and our economies are interdependent. It has shown us that solidarity and sharing between the peoples and the governments of the world are keys that will enable us to meet global challenges. In this respect, my country is providing its support to the recognition of Taiwan as a member of the international community fighting against climate change, this environmental and societal phenomenon which is unprecedented, which is threatening the well-being of current and future generations. Every contribution matters. More than ever, we must show responsibility and we must show greater determination to change the future for us and for future generations. We must act here and now. If we wait, it will be too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Pleasure to welcome His Excellency Sheikh Faleh bin Nasser Al Thani, Minister of Environment and Climate Change of Qatar. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the UK for hosting this COP. I'd like also to thank Italy for its valuable efforts in convening this conference. I'd like also to express my appreciation for the UNFCCC Secretariat. Ladies and gentlemen, Qatar attaches great importance to the threats posed by climate change. We spared no effort in the international response to counter climate change by hosting COP18 in 2012. We have also launched an initiative on Global Dryland Alliance, which is an international mechanism to counter climate change. Also, at UN Climate Action Summit in 2019, we contributed $100 million to support SIDS and LDCs. We have also instructed Qatar's Development Fund to provide financial support for green growth in these countries. In this light, we look forward to the 5th UN Conference on LDCs, which Qatar will host from the 23rd to 27th January 2022 as an opportunity to tackle the challenges facing these countries, challenges that undermine the abilities of these least developed countries to achieve sustainable development goals. Climate change is a national priority for Qatar, and we have developed realistic and bold ambitions to limit greenhouse gas emissions in all sectors. We are committed to achieve our ambitious goals. Recently, we have established an environment and climate change to ensure our methodic and continued interest in this subject and to develop future plans. We have also plans to invest in low-carbon technology, such as solar energy and capture sequestration of carbon. We also doubled the number of solar power plants for the production of electricity by 2030. We are also linking into developing other types of clean fuel like hydrogen. We also support transition to low-carbon energy, such as scaling natural gas exports in order to reduce our dependence on high-carbon emitting fuels. We are working with other countries to support this endeavor. Together with bolstering our production capacity in the liquefied natural gas industry, we are working to remove carbon from our gas production chain through building the largest carbon sequestration and capture plant in the Middle East. We are also expanding our annual capacity to reach 9 million of CO2 by 2030. We stress our commitment to invest in investment globally by implementing 1 million trees by 2022, when we are going to hold our football cup. Also, we'll be implementing 10 million trees by 2030. Further to our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have developed also a national strategy, a national environment strategy, which is based on our vision to achieve a balance between protection of environment and social and economic development. Ladies and gentlemen, given our belief to counter climate change, we will support national, international, and regional efforts to face up to challenges of climate change. In closing, we wish that this COP will achieve the desired goals and take unilateral and collective measures in order to face up to the challenges that are facing our humanity now and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Eric Eveling, Minister of Environment and Cooperatives of St. Kitts and Nevis. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, delegates, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis comes with one simple message. The time for action is now. We are here at a time when the entire world is languishing from the horrors of climate change, including sea level rise, extreme weather events, and dramatic changes in rainfall patterns. We are here at a time when coastal towns and villages, and even entire islands, face destruction, at a time when lives and livelihoods are at stake, all undoubtedly attributed to human interference. Yet, enough action is not being taken to remedy the situation that worsens with every second that the clock ticks. We are at a crossroad where the science is explicit that to contain climate change to an acceptable level, we must limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The latest IPCC report indicates that we still have a chance, but must act now in order to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. Climate change is real, and St. Kitts and Nevis has launched, during COP26, a more significantly ambitious revised nationally determined contribution NDC, proposing to reduce emissions by 61% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. Our revised NDC is an example of the leadership displayed by most vulnerable countries, in particular, us in the Caribbean and other SIDS and LDCs, as we continue to demonstrate leadership despite only being responsible for 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We suffer the most from a problem that we did not create. Yet, we are deprived of much-needed climate finance for loss and damage, mitigation, and adaptation efforts. This, Mr. President, is unacceptable, and it has to change. Developed countries and large emitters must recognize the need to improve access to finance, scale up climate finance, and make finance flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. We need climate justice. St. Kitts and Nevis will heavily invest in renewable energy, with plans for a 35-megawatt solar farm to be operational in 2 years, and we continue to aggressively pursue geothermal power. Climate-friendly policies will enable us to advance initiatives to reduce our carbon footprint. Our efforts have been complemented by the friendship of the Republic of China-Taiwan. Taiwan has demonstrated its commitment to the climate dilemma by enacting appropriate legislation and announcing an ambitious NDC, including achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Mr. President, with such exceptional efforts, Taiwan deserves a seat at the table, and I humbly ask that Taiwan be admitted to the convention. Mr. President, the gap between where we are heading and where we need to be is far too large, and we absolutely must have an outcome that fits the scale of this climate crisis. Let us stand on the right side of history. We cannot wait another day, week, month, or year. We need action now. The world is a global village, and the decisions you make in the United States affect us in the Caribbean. The decisions that you make in China, Canada, and the United Kingdom affect the little girl and boy in the Pacific. The world is depending on us at COP26, so let us not disappoint. I implore us all to solemnly pledge to save ourselves from extinction. As I close, I am obligated to remind us all that we are at code red, and the environment and planet Earth need champions. I am committed to being one, and so is my country, St. Kitts and Nevis. I leave you with this question: are you prepared to be one? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Mario Espino, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources of Guatemala. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presidents of the subsidiary bodies, distinguished delegates, general public. I'm the bearer of greetings from millions of Guatemalans who live in the country of the eternal spring. Today, as the Minister of Environment and National Resources of Guatemala, and in my capacity as President pro tempore of the Central American Commission of Environment and Development of the Central American Integration System, I ratify our condition as highly vulnerable region to atmospheric events, as reflected by the German Watch Global Climate Risk Index, which places at least 3 Central American countries among the 10 most affected by extreme weather-related events in the last 2 decades. And Guatemala is one of them. In addition, the report of the National Intelligence Council of the United States places Guatemala among the 11 most vulnerable countries in the world to the effects of climate change. Among the factors that affect us are our geographic location, poverty rates, and social conditions. The reports of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change have confirmed that natural phenomena represent a serious threat to the food security of the population, generates human migration, and damages the socio-economic dynamics, public finance, and governance of our nations. Added to this scenario is the enormous impact that COVID-19 pandemic has had, which depend on highlighted the economic and social problems that Guatemalan and Central American are experiencing. Guatemala has been hit by the effects of climate change with losses in the recent decade of approximately more than $6,000 billion given to this harsh reality that we are facing, and request that Central America be recognized as a highly vulnerable region to the impact of losses and damages imposed by natural disasters, and the need to opt for finance options that characterize for being of easy access and that come in a timely manner, as well as paramedic insurance that helped us rebuild the damaged infrastructure as a result of the extreme climate change events. At the regional level, we have also worked to formalize before this important space the request for support to the initiative to create in Guatemala the Regional Center for the Combat Forest Fighting, which will provide the prevention strategy to quick response for these events through regional interinstitutional coordination. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Malik Amin Aslam, Federal Minister for Climate Change of Pakistan. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Excellency, President of COP26, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Let me take this opportunity to thank the government and the people of United Kingdom for successfully hosting the conference in the beautiful city of Glasgow. Ladies and gentlemen, the ongoing COVID crisis has taught us 2 very important lessons. Firstly, that we cannot fight nature and win. The COVID crisis, biodiversity crisis, and the climate change crisis are all manifestations of this losing battle. Nature knows how to rebalance at it, and it will. It is us who need to step back from this war path. Secondly, the COVID crisis has shown us that a better world is out there. This is the world that the youth out on the streets is crying out for. This is the world that we all should be fighting here for. It is a decarbonized and nature-positive world. Excellency, under the visionary green leadership of our Prime Minister Imran Khan, Pakistan has taken the choice to embrace this new world, shifting to clean energy, and making nature an ally of development rather than an adversary. Our climate vision is built on these two pillars: shifting 60% of our energy mix towards clean energy by 2030, 30% of our transport towards electric transport by 2030, and putting our trust and investment in nature. Similarly, we have announced to completely shift out of imported coal projects and are turning the China-Pakistan economic corridor into the China-Pakistan Green Economic Corridor. We have already shelved 3 coal projects worth 2,400 megawatts and instead started 3,700 megawatts of hydropower last year. Pakistan's 10 billion tree tsunami has now become a global brand for successful ecosystem restoration in the world. The Protected Area Initiative in Pakistan has added 15 new national parks over the last year alone. Our Recharge Pakistan initiative is turning the crisis of floods into an opportunity by using it to restore our wetlands and recharge our aquifers. All of these are examples of real climate action today, not an illusion of climate action. And they are now part of our updated NDC, which is one of the most ambitious jumps in the world. We have dropped our emissions 9% below business as usual in 2020, and we have promised that by 2030, we will take our emissions 15% below business as usual with our own money. I repeat, these are with our own resources. At the same time, we have thrown a challenge to the world. Deliver us the climate finance of $100 billion, and we can drop our emissions to 50% below business as usual. Mr. President, with less than 1% of global emissions, Pakistan is certainly not a part of the problem, but we have decided to be part of the global solution to climate change. Our NDC shows what is possible if there is a clear climate vision and a strategic planning which get positively aligned. The World Bank recently affirmed that 44% of our mainstream development is climate friendly. So, Mr. President, we are not just talking, but we are walking the talk on climate change. Can this room also walk the talk on climate finance? Currently overpromised and underdelivered. The decade-old promise of $100 billion needs to be delivered. And more importantly, 60% of that needs to be directed to adaptation finance, which is a matter of life and death in countries like Pakistan. Even though we are not a major contributor, we continue to be on the top 10 list of most impacted countries for 10 straight years. This climate injustice, as viewed from Pakistan's lens, is the gravest human rights violation in humankind's history, where the lives and livelihoods of billions of people has been put at risk, all due to the unbridled pollution and uncontrolled excesses of a few. Mr. President, the galaxy of global leaders who gathered here last week unfortunately failed to live up to the expectations of the world and rise to the reality of the climate change challenge. Climate change cannot be wished away by throwing pennies into the Trevi fountain, nor by announcing net zero scams pushing into 2070. The average age of negotiators in this room is 60 years. They will all not be here by 2070. Climate change is about action today and can no longer afford futuristic IOUs. This has to be the decisive decade for decarbonization and a nature-positive development. Let me finish on a positive note. The silver lining of the process are not, unfortunately, found in this room. They are found on the sidelines in the pavilion zone, where the private sector initiatives are gaining ground, technologies are becoming available and more innovative, and financial mechanisms like the energy transition mechanism and nature-based performance bonds are pushing new frontiers. Pakistan is actively engaged in all of these, all of the out-of-box thinking on climate change. This is really what gives hope and a new world possible in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time. It is time to stop playing jokes with climate change. We will most certainly not have the last laugh on this. It is time to change course, and let us make that happen here at Glasgow. Let us not become the dinosaurs who refuse to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Carlos James, Minister of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development and Culture of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, and distinguished colleagues, this past year has been the most challenging period in St. Vincent and the Grenadines' post-colonial history. We continue to grapple with the challenges precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the devastation caused by the explosive eruption of the Laos volcano, and severe floods and landslides due to more extreme weather phenomena. These challenges underscore our intrinsic vulnerabilities and threaten our very existence. Mr. President, the most pertinent questions for our people are the following. How long will aspirational declarations and diplomatic maneuvering delay the concrete actions required to ensure our planet remains below 1.5-degree target? Will developed countries acknowledge that insufficient funding for adaptation measures results in catastrophic loss and damage to SIDS? Will G20 countries responsible for nearly 80% of carbon emissions honor their commitment to develop and implement ambitious NDCs to reduce global emissions? St. Vincent and the Grenadines therefore calls for urgent action to avert this climate crisis. The UNFCCC synthesis report clearly indicates that current NDCs are woefully inadequate. They will not bridge the gap between existing commitments and the 1.5 pathway. We must accelerate the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in this decisive decade to achieve net zero by 2050. Failure to take the necessary steps to address this climate crisis is reckless and endangers the 72 million people living in small island developing states. To compromise on the required targets and the measures is a death sentence for our people. Negotiating your way out of this responsibility is simply not an option. Mr. President, my country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, continues to do its part both nationally and internationally as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council in the global fight against climate change. We do so with the experience of our Prime Minister, Dr. the Honorable Ralphie Gonsalves, leading our charge in this forefront. However, new and additional finance, technology transfer, and capacity building support are required to ensure we can fully implement the Paris Agreement. We welcome the commitment of some developed countries to scale up financing pledges, and we urge others to deliver the outstanding $100 billion per annum commitment. This fight requires the inclusive action and meaningful participation of everyone, and therefore we commend Taiwan's efforts to legislate climate targets, and they should be also here at the negotiating table. Finally, Mr. President, COP26 must be remembered as the summit where we completed the Paris rulebook. Anything less will be unacceptable. Climate change, Mr. President, is the defining global challenge of our time. We cannot squander decades of hard work. The stakes are too high, and time is quickly running against the clock. Mr. President, I close by indicating that St. Vincent and the Grenadines joins with all other small island developing states, and we call on developed countries to act now. The time is now for us to act, and the time is now for us to take decisive action in combating climate change. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Bonkam Orasht, Minister of Natural Resources and Environment of the Laos People's Democratic Republic. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, on behalf of the Laos government, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the government of the United Kingdom, in partnership with Italy, for hosting this meaningful conference despite the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. President, early this year, the Laos government had revised its NDC that clearly outlined ambitious targets of the national actions for tackling climate change towards achieving net zero emission 2050. We have also set out lofty goals to achieve by 2030, which includes, among others, reducing the greenhouse gas emission by 60% and increase forest cover by 70%, and promoting the use of renewable and clean energy. Mr. President, in order to translate our NDC into reality, there is a pressing need for adequate financial resources, including enhanced financial and technical support and assistance from the international community. Especially development partners, it is our firm belief that granting access to climate finance and other sources of funding is of great importance to supporting developing countries, in particular LDCs, LLDCs, and CIS, to achieve their development goals and commitments made under the Paris Agreement. Mr. President, lastly, let me conclude by reiterating the Laos PDR reform commitment to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. In collaboration with all stakeholders, I would also like to call for strong political will coupled with concrete action taken by all parties to curb the rise in global greenhouse gas emissions and limited global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Adrian Piana, Minister of Environment of Uruguay. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
President, Uruguay expresses its gratitude and congratulations to the government of the UK for the intense work carried out in the face of today's crisis so we could be present here today. Uruguay reiterates its commitment to the Paris Agreement and remains convinced in the multilateral work under the Framework Convention being the only possible way to deal with the emerging climate crisis and the most important environmental challenge of our times. Uruguay has been completely at the brunt of the current effect of the greenhouse gases, although it hasn't contributed to it greatly at all, but it has borne the brunt of it, particularly with the most vulnerable populations. Our country has an economy which rests on socio-economic services across the Rio Plata Basin, which exposes its population to the various climate threats, which means that this is a particularly vulnerable country to the nefarious effects of climate change. And in this context, we find ourselves extremely committed to climate action, which we believe should be ambitious and have a strong social component. Nobody can be left behind. In 2020, we established a ministry exclusively dedicated to the environment, which further focused our work on this area. And we have a national policy for climate change with a national plan for adaptation for the fisheries sector. And in this conference, we're presenting our coastal adaptation program and our urban adaptation program for our infrastructure. We will be presenting and improving our first program, which was presented in 2017, which will further build on our work from 2015. Last Friday, our country presented a public consultation on our long-term climate strategy, which is focused on an ambitious program of reducing CO2 to zero by 2050. Uruguay has been established as a pioneer country in establishing early warning measures and response measures, in particular in the energy sector, where the renewable energy production in our networks have reached 95%, and we believe these ambitious targets will allow us to reduce our CO2 emissions both in this sector and in the transport sector. We're also rolling out our own national agenda for development. We've also established targets for abandoning carbon, and in 2022 we will be having a gasoline reduction tax which will increase the cost of conventional gasoline sales in our country. We also have an increasingly sustainable fishing sector which produces greater biodiversity, protects nature and reduces erosion. Forest occupies a large percentage of our space in Uruguay, and we have a significant carbon sink, therefore, in our country, and we are working in the framework of COP26, and in line with everything that we've been done, we have aligned ourselves with the Declaration on Forests and Soils, which is in line with all of our work that we've been done. In addition to our explicit commitment to climate change, our economic and social policies also are bolstered by our national budget, and we're working on an innovative program which incorporates the sustainability performance targets into our regular budget. President, adaptation to climate change is a political priority for our country. Uruguay is a serious and reliable country which honors its commitments. It produces food in a sustainable manner, and this requires recognition and to be valued. Uruguay would like to hold the big emitters feet to the fire, and we recognize the efforts being made by those developed countries that have met their commitments and their contributions to ensure that developing countries can be able to confront the challenges of climate change. Uruguay is significantly affected by this problem. It's not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Shaini Ghaffar, Minister of Development of Brunei Darussalam. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The current global pandemic has been to teach us about an even more existential threat, the climate crisis. Brunei Darussalam is a small country. 72% of our area is still forested, currently observing 97% of our domestic greenhouse gas emissions. 2 years ago, we celebrated a milestone, 90 years of our oil and gas industry. But really, for us, it was a celebration of 90 years as a carbon-negative oil and gas producing and exporting country. We have held this title long enough to continue to call nature as our #1 ally, not just for climate mitigation, but equally important for climate adaptation. As a small country located along the coast, our exposure to climate change is very high. We hear the sounds, we understand the devastating impact. We know the majority of our key strategic areas across the country could be underwater as early as 2050. This has urged us to look beyond our current efforts in keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive. Last year, we launched our national climate change policy, outlining 10 key strategies that would shape our low-carbon and climate-resilient future. We have also communicated our NDC at the end of the last year with a commitment to reduce 20% of our greenhouse gas emission by 2030. In further enhancing our climate ambition, Brunei Darussalam is moving towards a net zero by 2050, driven mainly through energy transition and forest preservation. It will not be an easy task ahead of us, but it is necessary. We have done this for almost a decade, and we will continue to maintain it. And this time around, we will be unlocking huge opportunities for green growth and green jobs. Our country only contributes to about 0.025% of the global greenhouse emission, but we believe with our small action, we make a huge positive difference. Mr. President, progress, however, requires action from many others. As ASEAN Chair this year, Brunei Darussalam is honored to present the ASEAN Joint Statement to COP26. ASEAN has reaffirmed the region's collective commitment on climate action, both to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. ASEAN calls upon developed country parties to strengthen support and cooperation to accelerate climate action in the region. Under the theme, We Care, We Prepare, We Prosper, ASEAN this year saw, among others, firstly, communications of enhanced indices, secondly, support in principle the establishment of ASEAN Center for Climate Change in Brunei Darussalam, thirdly, the creation of the ASEAN Youth on Climate Action Platform Program, fourthly, the development of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance. This includes the launching of the ASEAN Grid Initiative, Renew Regional Renewable Energy, and the energy efficiency and conservation targets in accelerating climate action. And lastly, let's now act, and let's now act together. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Fernando Andres Lopez Larinaga, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources of El Salvador. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Gracias, buenas tardes.
Thank you. Very good afternoon, President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Firstly, we'd like to thank the Government of the United Kingdom and the City of Glasgow for having organised this Conference of the Parties. It's a great pleasure to greet you once again in person. We've experienced a fairly difficult couple of years, but humanity has been able to grow and strengthen itself in the face of adversity. And we're very fortunate to be participating in person at this COP, following this difficult period created by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit our lives at all levels. The climate emergency that we've been dealing with for years now is now more present than ever, and confronting it is not an easy task. How many COPs will have to occur before we take action? This is a transcendental moment in our existence as a species. Although El Salvador possesses a low level of greenhouse gas emissions, we are at the brunt of the climate emergency generated by these. In our case, the most notorious manifestation of these is in events which have become increasingly frequent and extreme in recent years, giving rise to catastrophes which have left us with huge loss in human life and material goods and possessions. It's for this reason that the government in our country is undertaking the necessary actions to ensure strategic management of climate change with a view to promoting sustainable development which is low in emissions and resilient to climate change. We have developed a new Environment National Action policy identifying and strengthening priorities to ensure sustainable development in our country, among which we hope to guarantee the management of climate change and solutions based on nature, green infrastructure, and land organisation on the basis of the environmental dimension with proper management of water resources. And it's for this that in June last we presented in our National Assembly a new law on water resources, a historic commitment to our people which is finally seeing the light of day. This law guarantees the right to water and sanitation and establishes water as a public good which will never be privatised. We have updated and defined our NDCs with a new proposal, 2021 to 2025 proposal, which has been drawn up pursuant to a participatory process at the interinstitutional level, which is in its final stages of review. We've included plans, programs and policies with a strong commitment to renewable energy, which is also decentralized, with strategic emphasis on national energy development in order to foster its use at different sectors and levels. And to do this, we are including 80% of clean energy in our energy network. We need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. We've undertaken actions to promote resilience to climate change, such as the proposal to provide incentives focused on strategic projects around conservation, restoration and rehabilitation of ecosystems, using the countryside as a tool for environmental planning. These actions are fostering transition in agriculture and livestock, which leads to low emissions practices and an industry with good environmental credentials. This leads to excellent potential for carbon capture in our AFOLO sectors. Also, as a country who has prioritized cryptocurrencies, we know that technology moves forwards with every second. One of the mechanisms we have fostered to finance adaptation to climate change is the establishment of a mechanism to trade carbon bonds, which will be based on blockchain currencies, establishing a platform for transaction, monitoring, reporting and verification. All of this is done on a low-carbon model to reduce emissions to 2050. In terms of our adaptation to disaster risk reduction plans, we have an early warning system, as well as scientific investigation to promote timely information and provide this to the necessary end users. In order to do this, we have the International Santiago Network and the International Warsaw Mechanism for loss and damage. We must implement relevant and transparent actions, including a special management of finance transfer. For this, it's important that developed countries honour their commitments based on the historic responsibilities that we're all familiar with. We reiterate our commitment to continue supporting the actions to confront climate change and the transit to decarbonisation in order to ensure our sustainability, development and the well-being of our citizens. We have no planet B.
There is no time to waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Modibo Kone, Minister of Environment, Sanitation and Sustainable Development of Mali. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, United Nations Secretary General, Your Excellency, President of the 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Environment Ministers, Your Excellency, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, allow me to say to you, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, how much of an honour it is today to be able to speak to you as part of this August Assembly meeting, as part of the post-2020 Paris Agreement meeting. I would also like to thank you very warmly for your commitment to the entire negotiation process, which led to the historic agreement in Paris and the perfect organizations of the second climate summit, calling on parties to be more ambitious in their response to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the transition President Head of State of Mali, His Excellency Colonel Assimi Goïta, tasked me with leading the official Malian delegation with representatives of technical ministries, development structures, development, research and private sector to represent our country at this August Assembly. And I would like the whole international community to support our transition. This is a transition which will make Mali a democratic country, but also will make this country a country that will be able to effectively fight climate change. Mali's locked at the heart of the Sahel and the Sahara, has for decades been suffering from the devastating effects of climate change through, for example, desertification, recurrent drought, falling soil fertility, a decreasing purchasing power of the most vulnerable, and predictions on the impact of climate change, and these are particularly alarming. This inexorably saps our efforts to fight poverty. Despite these negative effects of climate change, my country remains committed to ensure that this Paris Agreement, which is a result of an exceptional level of mobilization, can respond and urgently so to our people's expectations. Hence our presence in Glasgow to demonstrate, to show the way forward and recall the urgency to act so that we can protect our countries, the most vulnerable countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we propose our most complete and ambitious national contributions, we recognise the responsibility and capacities of each country and the need for real and substantial financial support. We can set ourselves the ambition of creating a safer and more just world for our children and future generations. Mali believes that we must contribute as much as possible to this collective ambition, and it is in this spirit of solidarity that we are envisaging of increasing our ambitions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions compared with the base level of scenario of 2020 and 2030, which is 31% for the energy sector, 25% for agriculture, 39% for the forest and land use sector, 31% for waste. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the pillars of Mali's response to the climate change include our national environmental protection policy, our national programme for climate change adaptation, our national mitigation measures programme for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, our national policy to fight climate change, our national strategy to fight climate change, as well as our agricultural orientation law. Macroeconomically, our country is including the environmental aspect dimension in general and climate change in particular in our planning processes, particularly in the implementation of the strategic framework for economic recovery and sustainable development. This is a unique reference framework for all our country's development policies for the period 2019-2023. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Africa has been suffering from the negative effects of climate change, and this affects our sustainable development prospects, and our capacity for a transition will depend on mobilizing all the available resources and energy as well as innovation to address this challenge. We've also launched new regional initiatives, including for the River Congo Basin and for the Niger Commission to address the main regional problems linked to climate change, and this is being done at the highest level. Finally, we continue to play a constructive role in multilateral negotiations on climate change, and we present our national contributions, and we also contribute to strengthening the rules and procedures from the Paris Agreement. To implement all of these agreements, relevant actions have been undertaken across the country. We have a coalition on social drivers, initiative for climate ambition, the financing for a climate investment plan, and the declaration following the 828th meeting of the African Peace and Security Council, which provides with our country a climate change funding in line with the Africa Adaptation Initiation, and also the Leaders' Climate Pledge. We are committed to creating a new paradigm to tackle climate change that takes into account the human aspect as well as environmental and ecological aspects. We also expect from our partners that they shoulder their own responsibilities as part of the UNFCCC. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Yashi Panjor, Minister of Agriculture and Forests of Bhutan. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Kuzangbo and good evening. At the outset, let me congratulate you on the election as the President of COP26. On behalf of the Bhutanese delegation, I also would like to thank the United Kingdom and people of Scotland for warm hospitality and excellent arrangements made for the conference. With great pleasure, I have the privilege to acknowledge the kindness, friendliness nature of the security force, volunteers, and every individual citizen of Glasgow City. Everywhere we went, people were so friendly and helpful. From COP26, Bhutan, as the chair of the LDC's group and as a highly vulnerable country ourselves, I would like to appeal to the COP26 presidency and the negotiating partners to consider scaling up finance for adaptation, loss and damages, technology transfer, and capacity building to enable us recover from severe impacts of climate-induced disasters. LDCs do not contribute to GHG emissions, but bear the brunt of the climate change impacts. Water resources, agriculture, and infrastructure for life, food security, and livelihood are at risk in the fragile mountain ecosystems of countries like Bhutan. We are imposed on with loss and damages frequently induced by climate disasters. As such, adaptation is a priority for us. Adaptation, therefore, must be supported with grants in finance. We would like our partners to live up to the $100 billion climate finance commitment, and adaptation must receive equal share in climate financing. Mr. President, Bhutan, under the policy guidance of our environmental champion monarchs, have demonstrated enough leadership in environment conservation, and our low-emission development policy for climate change and sustainable development goals are committed. Just to set the tone in an example, we are committed to go e-mobility in our transport sector and energy-efficient housing to transform from fossil fuel-run transport and domestic cooking and heating. Initiating electric train transport, increasing electric vehicles in public and private transport across the country is an immediate target in our country. We would like to invite investors, governments, multinational donors, international NGOs, and the private sector to support such green initiatives in our country. The COVID-19 pandemic has hit everyone around the globe, but poorer nations already impacted by the climate crisis are the worst hit. We would like to request leaders to consider post-pandemic economic support rather than attempting to recover to pre-pandemic status. Mr. President, let me echo other Hindu Kush Himalayas initiatives and 3 messages of the region. The water tower of the world is at the worst hit, and with the slightest temperature rise can have detrimental impacts on its glaciers and downstream, as confirmed by the latest IPCC report. We need regional cooperation and global support in saving the Himalayas and the livelihoods of 250 million people living within those mountain ecosystems. While Bhutan acknowledges and welcomes the COP26 presidency's climate finance delivery plan, meeting the $100 billion goal and the contributions committed by the partners in LDCF replenishment, we would like to reiterate that climate finance must be predictable, easily accessible, and sustainable based on the priorities and needs of the vulnerable countries. Countries that are committed and have provided leadership prominence must be recognized with funding assurances. As we approach for the final week of the COP26, lots need to be done to conclude remaining work for implementing the Paris Agreement. We must speed up to deliver ambitious, concrete, and enhanced climate action and support. For Bhutan, let me once again reiterate that COP26 must deliver concrete decisions on enhanced ambition, adaptation, loss and damage, robust rule for implementation of market and non-market mechanism, and ensures environmental integrity and enhanced financial support for climate action. Mr. President, Bhutan remains committed to the principles and objectives of the Convention and Paris Agreement and calls on all parties to be flexible, open, and constructive to deliver a strong climate action and support. Our actions today will go a long way towards securing a green and sustainable future for generations to come. Please be reminded that we are not negotiating, but we are playing with the future generations. Thank you, and Tashdele.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. James Shaw, Minister of Climate Change of New Zealand. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Inga mana, inga reo, inga iwi, inga rau rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Mr. President, Excellencies, delegates, Aotearoa New Zealand's closest neighbours are amongst the first and the worst hit by the climate crisis, but who have contributed the least to global emissions. To illustrate what this means, last year our government was asked to assist a Pacific nation with the massive task of moving 42 villages inland away from rising waves. But for some, this isn't even an option. Villages in low-lying countries like Tuvalu, Tokelau and Kiribati have nowhere inland to go. I say this, Mr. President, because the work that my officials and I are here to do is important well beyond New Zealand's borders. 10 days ago, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and I made a commitment that the climate pollution that New Zealand is responsible for in the year 2030 will be half what it is today. Our upgraded nationally determined contribution brings New Zealand up to speed with the commitments that others have made. And it came off the back of a fourfold increase in the contribution that New Zealand will make to the $100 billion climate finance promise that we've all made. But as we all know, addressing the climate crisis is not just about setting long-term emissions reductions targets. It is about actually making a great many changes, large and small, that together will add up to a better, a cleaner future. Since I last addressed this gathering, New Zealand and Tokelau have taken some significant strides towards our low-carbon future. Last month, we passed legislation requiring companies to report to shareholders on their climate-related risks. We've also made it easier for people to purchase low-emission vehicles and quadrupled the amount that New Zealand Green Investment Finance has available to invest in the low-carbon technologies of the future. Is it enough? Not even close. That is why next year we will publish an emissions reduction plan setting the direction for climate action in New Zealand for the next 15 years. Mr. President, what we do here over the next few days will have a profound impact on the type of world that our children and our grandchildren inherit from us. My officials and I stand ready to agree to a common and transparent reporting system, as well as a system of cooperation and environmental integrity worthy of the promise laid out in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We are also ready to agree to new opportunities for increased support for Pacific countries suffering loss and damage. As we each continue the hard work of bringing emissions down in our own countries, we need to foster a just transition that leaves no country, community, or person behind. Nature-based solutions and the rights and the role of Indigenous peoples are also critical in the fight against the climate crisis. Mr. President, since 1990, the year that the world collectively decided that we needed to start reducing emissions, the world has roughly doubled the amount of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Political leaders at the time knew what was unfolding. They had a chance to stop it, but they didn't. And so it falls to us, right here, right now. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Barbara Della Cressy, Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment of South Africa. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, for Africa as a region that is particularly vulnerable to climate change, delayed climate action is not an option. We are facing the full impacts of the climate emergency even as we struggle to overcome the devastating socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic that has exacerbated Africa's special needs and circumstances. Our sustainable development efforts have been set back, and our message to the international community is clear. We need your support now, more than ever, to achieve our climate objectives in the context of a just transition. South Africa is making progress on our climate goals. We have established the Presidential Climate Commission, adopted the National Adaptation Strategy, implemented an enhanced mitigation system with robust monitoring and evaluation, and have developed a long-term low-emission strategy. We have submitted our updated and significantly more ambitious NDC ahead of COP26. This brings forward the peaking of our emissions by a decade and contains detailed information on adaptation and the support we require from the international community. True to the letter and the spirit of the Paris Agreement, the lower end of our 2030 updated target emissions range is consistent with a 1.5-degree pathway, while the upper end of the range is consistent with a 2-degree pathway. Where we get to in this range will depend on the international support we receive. Our country is developing detailed plans to enable a just transition to a low-carbon economy and climate-resilient society. These plans will locate support for affected workers and communities, and this will be at the center of all we do. Excellencies, to ensure that we have a balanced outcome at COP26, we need to send a clear signal that all three priorities of the Paris Agreement will be advanced with equal determination. In this regard, we need a 2-year work program on the global goal on adaptation under the CMA. This program must address the financing, economic, and social impacts of climate change on developing countries. To re-establish trust, we need developed countries to honor current obligations to provide finance and technical support. We must also move with speed to activate the post-2025 finance goal, because we on the African continent know that if we are to sustain the notion that COP26 is the ambition COP, we need a clearly defined, ambitious, long-term finance goal. This week, we must conclude Article 6. Environmental integrity and robust accounting need to be at the center. South Africa supports a share of proceeds as a source of predictable and sustainable financing for adaptation action in Article 6.2. Finally, we look forward to working with all parties to secure a fair deal for developing countries that not only enables us to meet our climate goals and targets, but also allows us to do our fair share to keep the planet habitable for future generations. South Africa is playing its part to make COP26 a successful conference, because we know that the world is watching all our actions, and we must do our best to deliver on our people's expectations. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Bruce Billimon, Minister of Health and Human Services of the Marshall Islands. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, and honorable ladies and gentlemen, I bring you warm greetings and Yahweh from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I'm speaking to you as a representative of a country under siege from the onslaught of climate change. The storm of climate catastrophe is gathering destructive power with every failed promise and missed targets. If there were ever a moment for bold and committed leadership, it is now and here in Glasgow. Mr. President, we cannot delay adapting to the changing climate any longer. No country will avoid its effects, and many countries will suffer irreparable damage. We must not only stay within the 1.5 degrees limit in order to survive, but prepare to survive the impacts associated with the increase. Some of us must act with greater urgency and consider more extreme measures than others. As a low-lying atoll nation, we know that physical responses like reclaiming land and building seawalls will take the cost of adaptation into the billions of dollars and will likely still not be enough to protect our country. If king tide storms and extreme weather events continue to ravage our shores, sea level continue to rise, and oceans continue to warm and become more acidic, bleaching and destroying our coral that represents our nation's very foundation, we will be left with limited options. As atoll nations, the failure of others to do what is necessary to tackle climate change forces us to grapple with extreme challenges. We will never accept that climate change, which we did not cause, should be the basis for a loss of our sovereignty, our sovereign rights, and our maritime boundaries. We will preserve our nation and our culture against any and all challenges that we face. The Marshall Islands need the support of developed countries in this critical undertaking, particularly those that have contributed the most to this crisis. Therefore, we must use COP26 to generate real change in how we address adaptation. We must provide the scientific and financial focus it demands. The Marshall Islands, therefore, call on donors to address the extremely wide gap that currently exists between mitigation and adaptation funding, and to ultimately achieve 50-50 split between them. As a first step, a commitment to at least doubling of adaptation financing from current level is essential. Mr. President, and we must form a strong foundation to ignite a step change on adaptation. The IPCC special report on 1.5 gave us a firm basis for the target agreed in Paris, and similarly, analysis on adaptation is needed. This is the critical decade for keeping 1.5 in check. We must cut emissions in half by 2030 to make this possible and to stay on track. We must all recommit to this target and take urgent action to deliver it. G20 leaders, your countries make up 80% of global emissions. The world is watching, and we urgently call you to take action reflecting ambition in enhanced NDCs and long-term strategies that align with the 1.5 pathway. All nations must demonstrate their ambition for this by urgently updating their NDCs to ensure alignment to this 1.5 survival figure. In Paris, we agreed that countries would be welcome to submit NDCs at any time. Again, if there is ever a time in which we must act upon opportunity to increase ambition, to demonstrate this commitment, it is now. We cannot come back to the table we must come back to the table at COP27 with a 1.5 aligned indices and keep coming back to the table until we are on the right track. COP26 here in Glasgow has the power to accelerate unprecedented shift in global economy. It is already underway, though far too slowly. We must put an end to worst offenders. Coal and super pollutants must go, and we must put an end to fossil fuel subsidies. We should not pay for our own destructions. Nonetheless, during this COP and over the past few months, we have heard encouraging sentiments from respective leaders of the world on the path for collective fight against climate change. Critical transport sectors like aviation and shipping keep the global economy moving. However, left unchecked, will also spell global destruction. We must reach zero emission by 2050 in maritime shipping and implement a carbon levy to meet the target in a way that not only catalyzes innovation, but also provides crucial resources for the vulnerables. We welcome new opportunities that support sustainable ocean-based economies and large-scale marine protected areas. Mr. President, we will not see a safe and secure future that leaves no one behind without resources. The delivery of the 100 billion is vital, and as we initiate discussions on a post-2025 financial goal, we must ensure that we base these decisions and discussions on accurate assessment of needs, and as always, at the heart of our work, the science. The Paris Agreement rulebook must be completed in a way that puts ambition and environmental integrity at its core. Article 6 is a critical tool for driving decarbonization and has the potential to provide a predictable funding stream for adaptation. But the wrong system will set us further back than we can afford. Mr. President, we urge fellow parties to honor and respect their obligations to future generations, to commit to the Kwan Kesh Climate Pledge, and to involve youth in the self-determined decisions that will shape their future. The climate crisis will affect us all, but some remain excluded from these discussions. The Republic of the Marshall Islands supports Taiwan's inclusion in the UN system and their full involvement in these discussions. Mr. President, at COP25 in Madrid, we committed to using our newly secured seat at the Human Rights Council to advance climate justice, and we are proud to play a role in instituting a special rapporteur on climate change at the Human Rights Council. And finally, Mr. President, we convene the High Ambition Coalition and stand ready to support progress at this COP. It is clear that ambition this year is not limited to one element of the Paris Agreement, but rather on a package of outcomes on mitigation, adaptation, and finance. The demands here in Glasgow are highly ambitious and difficult. Nevertheless, let us come together to meet them for the sake of our collective future and for the sake of humanity. Kamol Tata, and I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Ariel Oviedo, Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Paraguay. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
President of the Conference of the Parties, 26, Alok Sharma, and through you, all of the authorities present today. I bring the greetings of the President of Paraguay to you, who expresses his recognition and thanks to you for this organization and for hosting us. Esteemed delegates from the world over, we all know that to solve global problems, we need collective solutions. But these must be based on a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. On the basis of this principle, Paraguay, whose historic, geographic, social and economic context doesn't allow it to emit in the same way as others have emitted and continue to emit. Nonetheless, we are extremely vulnerable and we are seriously affected by the adverse effects of climate change. We suffer from floods, droughts, and even extreme temperatures up to 50 degrees C. Although it's correct that we are responsible for an extremely small percentage of emissions at the global level, specifically 0.09%, for years we have been shouldering our responsibility, working with agriculture, direct sowing, natural livestock raising, and complying with norms for the conservation of forests, as well as protecting water courses. We have been carrying out various projects for the conservation around the culture of our indigenous brothers, promoting renewable and clean energy, and giving to the world the environmental services of our millions of hectares of forests which continue to consume and soak up tons of carbon produced by other nations. We also recognize the requirement to strengthen the monitoring mechanisms of those standards and norms, which rest on budgetary allocation and require further investment, a characteristic of developing countries. But those actions have a value not only at the national level, but they benefit the entire planet. And for this reason, we promote fair and transparent practices around trade based on science, recognizing the need to develop in all sectors. Climate change is going far faster than our ambition and negotiation ability. It's time to redouble our efforts, and we need to be coherent between what we think and what we do. Technology has demonstrated to us that we can do everything we want to do without needing to emit greenhouse gases, principally carbon dioxide, which are generated, for example, with the flights the delegations from hundreds of countries must take to attend the various meetings, ironically, to try to reduce temperature increase caused by greenhouse gas emissions. We should also not forget that the countries which are developing must have improved access to funding measures provided internationally to adapt ourselves without forgetting mitigation, compensating the advantages we will never benefit from. The costly steps that need to be taken are essential, and in Paraguay, through the Ministry for the Environment and Sustainable Development, we have allied ourselves not only with public institutions but also with the private sector and the finance sector, designing public policies and strategic plans which will help us to attain not only SDG 13 climate action but also everything related to environmental protection. In Paraguay, we're well aware that public funding brought internally by developing countries will be insufficient to comply with our commitments to our NDCs. And for this reason, developed countries must comply with their commitment to provide as a minimum $100 million each year for climate funding. They are not reaching this target. It's also clear to us that The goal will only be attained if we think intelligently about how we use existing funds. This must be understood also by the UN agencies and other cooperating agencies. These agencies must ensure that states achieve the comprehensive well-being of their populations and that they do this without leaving their population behind. And it's important at this COP to increase how we leverage the value of our forests and ensure that there's a nominal value that the forests have, which is greater or equal to agricultural lands. We must have solutions based on nature and adaptation. And to conclude the Paris Rule Book, we must ensure that we spare no effort in order to ensure that we don't lose hope and lose our way. Finally, President and esteemed representatives of all the countries, we must continue our discussions, recognizing that we have made a great deal of progress, but still there is a serious shortfall in our progress. We must undertake an active role to garner the consensus which will allow us to reach the target of keeping industrial temperature increase under 2 degrees vis-à-vis the industrialization period. We must ensure that we leave no one behind, particularly the most vulnerable. All of this means that we must confront the effects of climate change and make effective and concrete efforts to adapt and mitigate without affecting food security, because all of this is what the development of our societies depends on. This is an urgent task.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Carlos G. Dominguez, Secretary of Finance, Chairman Designate of the Climate Change Commission of the Philippines. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. The Philippines is determined to be a world leader in this fight against climate change. We account for only 0.3% of total greenhouse emissions, yet we bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change. Our country is sinking at the rate of 4 times faster than the global average. Annually, we are confronted with increasingly severe typhoons, floods, and droughts. Millions of lives are at stake. Clearly, climate change is very real to the Philippines. To challenge ourselves and the rest of the world, we set the boldest national goal put forward by any country. Under President Rodrigo Duterte's administration, the Philippines commits to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75% in 2030. We are moving ahead with urgency to fulfill our ambitious target. We shifted from theorizing about climate change to executing practical climate adaptation and mitigation projects on the ground. We have put forward together a group of Filipino experts who represent all corners of the Philippines to engage our fishermen and farmers and prepare them to execute localized action projects. We just launched the Sustainable Finance Roadmap to deploy engines of finance to get green projects moving across our archipelago, to urge Filipino people to do their part on a daily basis in saving the world's environment. We are pushing for a law banning single-use plastics. We launched a partnership with the Asian Development Bank for a landmark project that will accelerate our transition from coal to clean energy. This comes after President Duterte declared a moratorium on new coal plants a year ago. These are concrete actions to demonstrate to the world how a developing and climate vulnerable country like the Philippines can lead in the fight to save our planet. This also shows our commitment not to merely empty or half-baked promises, but are supported by actionable projects on the ground. We have very high expectations for COP26 to become not just merely an annual platform for discussion, but a catalyst for concrete action plans. It is time to do some actual work on the ground and build a framework for climate justice. Those who have polluted and continue to pollute the Earth's environment through unthinking industrialization starting 200 years ago must pay for the grants, investments, and subsidies needed for the most vulnerable countries to adapt to climate change. The time for debate is over. It is time to finally begin acting on the fulfillment of our commitments and obligations to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. On behalf of the conference, I would like to thank you all for your statements. Distinguished delegates, we will continue with the delivery of national statements tomorrow at 10 in this plenary. With this, I declare this joint meeting of COP, CMP, and CMA adjourned.